The garden left open August melted into September, and the village of Marleycombe exhaled. The flowers at Harrowby Hall bloomed without restraint, and with Basil Marchmont awaiting trial in London, a strange kind of peace began to settle, not just in the village, but within the people who had lived through the shadow of what happened. But peace, Miss Marple always said, was not the absence of trouble. It was the quiet understanding of having survived it. A new routine Vivian Marchmont could now be seen each Thursday walking to the market, her stride no longer clipped and defensive, but slower, thoughtful. She stopped to greet Mrs. Cribbins at the flower stall, and once even gave her remaining plum jam to the schoolteacher's wife. Not everyone warmed to her. Some still crossed the street. Some always would, but Vivian no longer flinched. She had come to understand that guilt, grief, and shame were not enemies. They were seasons, and like all seasons, they passed, if not entirely, then at least enough to breathe again. A letter from Rosalind one morning. Miss Marple received a thick envelope in Rosalind Marchmont's tight, elegant hand. Inside was a single-page letter. Dear Miss Marple, I imagine you already know this, but I wanted to say it plainly. You were right. I spent so long guarding the Marchmont name that I forgot what the name was supposed to mean. Isabel deserved more from all of us, not just Basil, but me as well. I've left Harrowby Hall to Vivian. I suspect she'd do far better with it than I ever could. As for me, I'm going north, to a small cottage by the sea. I'm told the gulls are loud, and the tea is dreadful. I shall take both as penance and blessing. With reluctant respect, Rosalind M. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it neatly into her desk drawer. She did not smile, but she did sigh, a soft, almost fond sound. A question from the vicar's niece that Sunday. The vicar's young niece, Marigold, came skipping up to Miss Marple after service. "Aunt Jane?" she asked, eyes bright and voice urgent. "Is it true you solved the murder at the big house?" Miss Marple looked down at her. "I only listened, dear," she said. "And sometimes listening is more powerful than people think." "But you caught the bad man, didn't you?" Miss Marple bent down, brushing a wisp of hair from the girl's cheek. "No, child," she whispered. "He caught himself. I merely opened the door." The garden left open that evening. In the fading light of day, Miss Marple took her tea in the garden. The roses were thick with bloom, the bees content and lazy. Somewhere, a blackbird sang a hesitant tune. She glanced toward the low gate that led to the lane. It was ajar, not locked, not guarded, and she thought how strange it was that after all the pain, the loss, the years of secrets, sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is leave a gate open, to change, to begin again, to forgive. The mask removed, the summer fete returned to Marleycombe, just as it always had, bunting strung across the green, tables loaded with sponge cakes and jam pots, and the vicar cheerfully judging the Victoria sponge competition. But this year, beneath the surface of village cheer, something was different. It wasn't just that Rosalind Marchmont had withdrawn from public life, or that Harrowby Hall had opened its gates, quite unusually, for the villagers to tour the restored rose gardens. It was a feeling, a quiet awareness that a truth had been spoken, and the village would never quite be the same again. A visit from Harwood Inspector. Harwood arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that morning, not with questions but with a bouquet of delphiniums and a look of subdued admiration. "I don't say this often," he said, awkwardly twisting his cap, "but I think we would have bungled the whole thing without you." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe you would have reached the truth eventually." Harwood snorted. "Not with that lot. Too many masks, too many secrets. You peeled it all back with a teacup and a chat." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea, then said gently, It's always about people, Inspector. Not facts. Not fingerprints. People. The last mask that afternoon, Vivian Marchmont stood before a modest crowd in the village hall. She didn't speak as a Marchmont. She didn't wear red. She didn't even stand on the platform. Instead, she read aloud a passage from one of Isabel's notebooks, one of the few not destroyed. To love someone does not mean to keep them quiet. It means to listen, even when their truth burns your pride. There was silence when she finished. Then, a few claps. One or two nods. But most importantly, no judgment. Only understanding. Tea at the vicarage. Again, as the fete wound down, Miss Marple found herself once more at the vicarage garden table, a plate of seed cake before her, and a fresh pot of Darjeeling. Between her and the Reverend, you must admit, he said, stirring his sugar, this one was a bit darker than the last murder. Oh, I don't compare murders, Miss Marple replied dryly. They're not sponge cakes. The vicar chuckled. Still, it makes one wonder. Do we really ever know the people around us? Miss Marple looked toward the village green, where children now played beneath the same trees that had once whispered secrets. We know what they let us see, she said quietly. But if we watch closely and care enough, sometimes we see a little more. The velvet mask that evening, in the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple took out her sewing basket. Beneath a swatch of linen lay something odd, a small velvet mask. Worn and old, once used for a charity masquerade at the hall years ago. She looked at it for a long moment, then folded it gently back into the basket. Not all masks were evil, she thought. Some were just the things we wore, until we no longer needed them. 1. A voice left behind the summer sun returned to Marleycombe with unsettling cheer, casting golden light over dark secrets buried, if not forgotten. In the wake of Basil Marchmont's arrest and Vivian's quiet reckoning, a strange hush had settled over Harrowby Hall, but one detail remained unresolved, and Miss Marple, who never left threads dangling, returned to the one clue that had whispered to her most persistently, the voice from the music box. The hidden cylinder Vivian found it by accident. She was clearing the storage alcove behind Isabel's bedroom, a place filled with moth-eaten shawls and dusty opera programs, when she knocked over a box. Inside was an extra cylinder for the music box. Not decorative, but hand-inscribed. Its grooves etched with subtle care. Miss Marple was called immediately. Together, they wound the box and listened. Instead of the familiar lullaby, a woman's voice emerged, faint, trembling, but unmistakably Isabel's. If you are hearing this, I have failed. Or perhaps I've finally succeeded in escaping. I am Isabel Marchmont, and I was never mad. Vivian gasped, her hands to her mouth. Miss Marple listened without blinking. They kept me here, not with chains, but with shame. And Basil, if he ever learns the truth, he will destroy what remains of this family. There was a pause. Then, I do not wish revenge. Only that someone one day will tell the truth. The cylinder clicked softly as it ended. A promise made. I never knew, Vivian said, sitting very still, the box in her lap. I thought she wrote letters, but to think she left her voice behind. She wanted someone to hear her, Miss Marple said. And I believe you just did. Vivian nodded, then looked to Miss Marple. What do I do now? You tell. The truth, Miss Marple replied, but kindly, carefully, and only to those who need to know. A letter to Scotland Yard. Miss Marple wrote one final letter that evening. It was addressed to Inspector Harwood, and in it she included a transcript of the cylinder's message, as well as her own conclusions. There was no single murderer, only layers of fear and silence. Isabel was imprisoned not just by those around her, but by the time she lived in. Justice may have been served with Basil's arrest, but the healing, I think, will take much longer. Let Marleycombe have its peace. Now, it has earned it. The garden blooms again by week's end. The rose garden at Harrowby Hall had been cleared of its dead stems and overgrown thorns. Vivian had begun planting new varieties, memory roses. She called them. Miss Marple visited once. Walking quietly among them, hands clasped behind her back, a fresh breeze stirred the leaves. And somewhere far off in the hall, the music box played once more, not a dirge, not a ghost's lament, but a soft, almost cheerful waltz. And Miss Marple smiled. The quiet undoing the village of Marleycombe, so proud of its lilacs and orderly hedgerows, never quite knew how to speak of what had happened at Harrowby Hall. There was no dramatic trial, no front-page scandal in the Daily Gazette, just a few hushed remarks at the post office, a glance exchanged over scones at the tea-room, and silence, long and careful, from the Marchmont family itself. But Miss Marple knew, and so did those who had chosen to look. The day after Rosalind Marchmont did not attend church the following Sunday, her housekeeper said she was indisposed. But the truth was more complicated. In the quiet of the East Wing, she stood alone in Isabel's old room. The window was open. A breeze stirred the lace curtains. The music box, now repaired, sat on the windowsill, playing its soft, lilting tune. She did not cry. Rosalind Marchmont was not a woman who cried, but she did sit down at her sister's old writing desk, open the drawer, and begin to write. Not a letter, not a confession, but something like a story. Miles leaves Marleycombe. Miss Marple watched from the vicarage gate as Miles Marchmont boarded the morning train to Brighton. He carried only a small case and a copy of The Old Man and the Sea tucked under his arm. He paused as he saw her, removed his cap, and gave a tired, grateful smile. "I should have listened to you," he said, "from the very beginning." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes we all listen too late. But at least you listened. Do you think she's at peace now, Isabel?" she asked. "Yes, I think she is." Tea with the vicar that afternoon. The Reverend Pritchard poured Miss Marple a cup of Earl Grey with a trembling hand. "Poison," he murmured. "In Marleycombe. Who would have imagined?" "Anyone who knows people," Miss Marple replied gently. "We are all capable of terrible things, given the right pressure and the right secrets." He blinked. "You make it sound so ordinary." "Because it is." She sipped her tea. "It's just that most people wear masks, velvet ones, sometimes, to make themselves feel better about it." Vivian's decision. Vivian Marchmont didn't leave the hall. She stayed. She moved into Isabel's room, turned the sitting room into a conservatory, and asked the village library for books on grief and rehabilitation. The villagers cautiously began to accept her again. And in time, children began to wave at her when she passed by the green. Vivian never again wore red. Miss Marple's final note back in her cottage. Miss Marple returned her small notebook to its drawer. On the final page, she had written just one line. Not. Every mask is worn to deceive. Some are worn to survive. She closed the drawer, poured herself a final cup of tea, and turned her face to the garden. The bees were humming, and the village was, for now, at peace. The second mask for the first time in the investigation. The path ahead had a shape. Miss Marple had peeled back the velvet layers surrounding Isabel's death, the masks worn by the Marchmont family, the ghosts of Leonard's manipulation, and the grief and guilt that bound them all. And now she saw something else. There had been two killers, one in action, one in silence. Vivian had admitted to planting the seed of suspicion in Miles's mind, but Miss Marple didn't believe Vivian. Had poisoned the teacup. Someone else had stepped in at the last moment. Someone more ruthless. Someone with more to lose. The inspector's visit. Inspector Harwood was less than thrilled by the idea of shared guilt. So we're not charging Miles Marchmont? No, said Miss Marple. He was a weapon, but he wasn't the hand that guided it, and he certainly didn't deliver the final blow. You think someone else slipped the poison in? I do. And they used Miles's suspicions to cover their own intentions. Harwood sat back. Who, then? Miss Marple folded her hands. The person who stood to lose the most if Isabel ever left Harrowby Hall, or told the full truth about her. Past. Tea with Rosalind Miss Marple returned once more to the hall. Rosalind was alone in the drawing-room, pouring tea with her usual elegance, though the tray trembled slightly. You've spoken to Vivian, haven't you? She said quietly. I have. And she told you everything? No, Miss Marple replied. Not everything, but enough to understand that Vivian lit the match and someone else lit the fire. She leaned in slightly. Rosalind Isabel was your sister, and you let her live in silence. She chose that, Rosalind snapped. No, she accepted it, because it was the only thing you would give her. The final clue Miss Marple laid a small object on the table. A tiny bottle, labeled in faint print, Digitalis extract, empty. Found this in your dressing-table drawer, Miss Marple said calmly. Rosalind stared. I didn't put it there. But someone did. Likely the same person who put the poison in Isabel's cup. She paused. Tell me, Rosalind, who has access to your bedroom? Rosalind blinked then, very softly said, Basil. The nephew's secret Miss Marple found. Basil in the library, reading poetry. He looked up, startled. Miss Marple? She held up the bottle. I believe you left this in your aunt's room. Basil went still. I didn't mean for her to die, he said at last. She was going to leave, wasn't she? She was going to tell the truth about Leonard, about my mother. Do you know what that would have done to this family? 2. Our name? She was your aunt. She was a problem, he said, bitterness creeping into his voice, one that never went away. An arrest at dusk Inspector Harwood arrived, as the sun dipped below the HEDEROW's. Basil was calm as they led him away, but not proud. Miss Marple thought he looked tired, as if the truth had been a weight he could finally put down. Vivian was never arrested. Miss Marple saw to that. She will live with what she did, she told Harwood, and that is sentence enough. Final conversation that evening. Miss Marple sat in the garden of the vicarage, watching the moon rise above Marleycombe. She sipped her tea slowly. 2 killers, 2 masks, 1 tragedy, but perhaps, no, peace. A whisper through the keyhole. The letter had changed everything. It proved what Miss Marple had suspected. Isabel Marchmont's death was not the product of one person's madness, but a carefully orchestrated silence. A silence enforced by fear, secrecy, and legacy. And now someone else, someone still alive, had heard Miss Marple discover the letter. The peacock blue thread was no coincidence. Someone was watching. A visit from Rosalind. The next morning, Rosalind Marchmont arrived at the vicarage. Unannounced. Her face was pale but composed. Her coat was perfectly tailored. But her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were trembling. I heard, she said without preamble, that you've been in the East Wing. I have, and that you found something. I did. Rosalind's eyes lowered. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might break. Then Rosalind said, quite evenly, You must understand. My husband was not a kind man. But in our world, in our generation, one didn't speak of such things. Not even to one's sister. She wasn't just your sister, Miss Marple said gently. She was your shadow, and you tried very hard not to see her. Rosalind winced. She wanted more than I could give. More freedom, more truth. And when Leonard found out who she really was, she trailed off. What did he do to her? Rosalind looked up. He kept her close and made sure she never had the chance to leave. The housekeeper's memory later that day. Miss Marple called on Mrs. Glenwood. The housekeeper, a woman of sharp memory and precise habits. "I was hoping," Miss Marple said gently, "you might remember something about the masquerade, or perhaps about the music box." Mrs. Glenwood frowned. "That little thing? I used to hear it sometimes, late at night. Always the same tune. Mr. Marchmont gave it to her, I think. But she never looked happy when she played it." "Did anyone else visit her after Mr. Marchmont died?" "Just Miles, and Mr. Basil, occasionally. But mostly Miss Vivian." Miss Marple paused. "Vivian Marchmont?" The housekeeper nodded. "She used to sit with Isabel for hours. Bring her books, tea. I think she felt sorry for her. Or guilty," Miss Marple thought. A glove in the garden that evening. Walking through the rose gardens behind the hall, Miss Marple made a quiet discovery. A single glove, delicate, lady size, cream-colored, tucked behind the statue of Saint Cecilia. She picked it up carefully. Inside, stitched faintly into the silk lining, was a name. V.H.E. Confrontation. The following morning, Miss Marple visited Vivian at her cottage on the edge of Marleycombe. Vivian was watering her gardenias. "I think," Miss Marple said without preamble, "you loved Isabel." Vivian turned slowly. Her eyes did not deny it. "And when Leonard Marchmont died," Miss Marple continued, "you might have thought it was over, that she could finally be free. But instead, the house closed tighter. Rosalind ignored her. The villagers whispered. And someone, perhaps you, decided to take matters into your own hands." Vivian's face remained still. "You guided Miles, didn't you?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet now. "You planted the seeds. The resentment, perhaps even the idea of poison. You wanted justice. But you didn't want blood on your hands." Vivian closed her eyes. "I only wanted her to be safe. I didn't mean for her to die." "But she did die," Miss Marple said softly. "And you let Miles take the blame." Secrets in the East Wing. The East Wing of Harrowby Hall had long since fallen out of regular use. Rosalind kept it shut, except for the occasional airing or dusting. "It has a draft," she would say with a shiver. But Miss Marple knew that people often avoid places not because they're cold, but because they remember. And Isabel Marchmont had lived there, quietly and out of sight, for over a decade. That was where Miss Marple asked to go next. She carried with her a small torch, a pair of gloves, and the instinct, honed over years, that the dead often leave more behind than just their bodies. The room of the lost. Sister Isabel's chamber was small but elegant. The wallpaper had faded, and the dressing table stood like a relic of another life. Crystal perfume bottles half filled, a comb still holding strands of silver blonde hair. Miss Marple moved slowly, respectfully, scanning for the overlooked dot. She paused by the vanity. The bottom drawer, as Basil had said, was locked. But locks, as Miss Marple liked to remind her godson Raymond, only stop people who respect them. She took a fine hairpin from her bag, and with some quiet finesse, the drawer gave way. Inside was the music box. She recognized it immediately. Dark mahogany, beautifully carved, and with a faint scent of rosewood and dust. Miss Marple turned the key gently. The melody was delicate, something sorrowful, almost haunting. A tune you might hum in secret, but it wasn't the song that mattered. It was the false bottom inside. The final letter hidden. Beneath the velvet lining was a folded letter. Miss Marple's gloved fingers opened it with care. The handwriting was neat, Isabel's. The ink smudged near the end, as if her hand had shaken. "To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, then something has happened to me. I fear I've waited too long to speak, and now I am being watched, perhaps even followed. Leonard Marchmont knew I was not Rosalind's cousin. He discovered the truth 5 years ago, that I am her half-sister. Our father had a child out of wedlock. He used it against me, made me his confidant, sometimes worse. I tried to stay for Rosalind, for Basil, but I was growing tired. And then I saw the velvet mask again, in the hallway. Leonard is dead, but someone else is wearing his secrets now. Miss Marple lowered the paper. Her eyes remained on the final line. I no longer know who I can trust. A hidden listener, as she stood there, music box still playing its mournful tune. Miss Marple heard the softest shift of weight outside the room. A creak on the floorboards. She turned slowly and opened the door. No one, but a single peacock blue thread had caught on the hallway's antique chair. Someone had been listening. Someone who knew what was hidden in the East Wing, and hadn't wanted it found. Miss Marple's theory that evening, over tea at the vicarage. Miss Marple laid out what she now believed to be true. Leonard Marchmont manipulated Isabel for years, she said, not just because of her secret, but because he enjoyed control. And when he died, someone else picked up where he left off. The vicar's wife paled. You mean Miles? No, said Miss Marple gently. Miles was used. He had rage, yes, but not the mind for blackmail. Someone guided him. Someone nudged him toward the idea of poison and let him believe it was his idea. She paused. There is still a killer, and it's not who anyone thinks. The ghost of Leonard Marchmont. Miss Marple had seen it before. The long shadow of a dead man cast across the lives of the living. And at Harrowby Hall, that shadow belonged to Leonard Marchmont. Though gone 5 years, his name was still spoken. In cautious tones, a decorated war hero, a patron of the arts, a charming host, a master of appearances. But behind the charm, Miss Marple had begun to detect something else. Something darker. It was in the tightness around Rosalind's eyes when his name was mentioned, in the guarded tone of Basil's voice, and now in the crimson velvet mask stitched with Leonard's initials, hidden for nearly a decade in the attic above the family's memories. Harwood, frowning, placed the mask on the desk before him. You're suggesting Leonard Marchmont was involved in whatever. This is? Not involved, Miss Marple replied softly. But he started it. The masquerade ball of 1936. Back in the study of the hall, Miss Marple asked Rosalind about the charity masquerade ball from nearly 10 years earlier, the one Isabel had attended, just months after arriving at Harrowby. Rosalind was silent for a long time. It was Leonard's idea, she said finally. He liked drama, masks, games. He invited half the county, and he insisted that all the women dress in red. Why? Because he wanted to be able to approach anyone without knowing who they were, and without being recognized. Did he know Isabel's identity? No, Rosalind said, then added, at least, I don't think he did. But he suspected? Rosalind looked up sharply. He always suspected everyone of something. He liked secrets. He collected them like trophies. The velvet mask returns that evening. Miss Marple visited Basil's room. The young man sat propped in bed, pale but recovering. The curtains were drawn. A book lay unopened on his lap. Miss Marple set the velvet mask on the side table. Basil stared at it as though it might move. Where did you find that? In the attic, alongside the rest of your late uncle's collection. Tell me, Basil, what did Leonard Marchmont have on Isabel? Basil swallowed hard. I don't know. Not exactly. But I do know. He used to meet her in the library. At night, when no one else was around. How long did this go on? Years, Basil said. Even after she moved into the East Wing. Rosalind pretended not to notice. But I think it made her furious. Did you ever see him give her anything? Basil hesitated. Yes, he said at last. Once. A small wooden box. Locked. She kept it in her drawer. Miss Marple's heart lifted slightly. A music box? Yes. How did you? She had it in her hands when she died? Unfinished business back in her room at the village inn, Miss Marple opened her notebook. She began to write. Leonard. Marchmont knew Isabel's secret. He used it to control her, possibly even to hurt her. But someone else found out. And the moment Isabel tried to break free, she was silenced. The pieces were shifting again. Miss Marple felt it in her bones. Not just a single killer, but a chain of actions, a web of deceit spun across generations. One death, two masks, and a village full of people who had all warned them. A man behind the mask. For 2 days after Miles Renfield's arrest, Harrowby Hall fell eerily quiet. The village of Marleycombe buzzed with gossip. Of course, shops whispered the tale over loaves of bread and bolts of cloth. The postmistress claimed she'd always thought the boy a little intense, and the vicar's wife kept clutching her pearls during tea. But inside the hall itself, a strange kind of stillness had taken hold. Rosalind had retreated entirely from view. Basil was confined to bed with what Dr. Hargrave tactfully called shock fatigue, and the servants went about their duties with an air of controlled solemnity. Only Miss Marple moved quietly through. The house, noticing what others ignored, a door that no longer creaked, a cushion out of place, a diary left open just a little too carelessly. She knew the case was not entirely closed. Miles may have poisoned Isabel Marchmont. But the question no one wanted to ask was this: who taught him how? Vivian's confession. Miss Marple invited Vivian Marchmont to tea in the village. They sat beneath the low beams of the Plowman's Arms, tucked into a back room away from listening ears. "I believe you know more than you've said," Miss Marple began. "About Isabel, about Miles, perhaps even about Rosalind." Vivian stirred her tea, then placed the spoon down with elegant precision. "You think I had something to do with her death?" "I think," said Miss Marple calmly, "that you were the last person Isabel truly trusted, that she may have written to you or told you something in the final weeks of her life." Vivian's lips tightened. "She told me she was afraid, that someone was watching her. I thought she meant Rosalind. Was she?" "No," Vivian said. "She was wrong. She thought Rosalind was behind the threats. But Rosalind was only trying to keep the family name out of the papers." "And Miles?" Miss Marple asked. Vivian hesitated. "He was unraveling. Isabel didn't realize it. She wanted to believe in the son she had lost, but he'd been alone too long, filled his head with entitlement, anger. She looked down. I tried to warn her, but I was too late." A mask in the attic that evening, just before the rain returned, Miss Marple asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Glenwood, to let her see the attic. "Begging your pardon, miss, but there's nothing up there but old costumes and trunks." "All the more reason to look," Miss Marple said pleasantly. The attic at Harrowby Hall was dusty and close, the air thick with mothballs and forgotten summers. Miss Marple moved from box to box, brushing aside cobwebs, until she found one marked Charity. Masquerade minus 1,936. Inside were velvet cloaks, feathered fans, and something else. A velvet mask, deep crimson, with a faint trace of powder on the inside dot, and on the edge, just like on the portrait, a set of initials, carefully stitched in gold thread. L.M. The silent witness, Miss Marple, brought the mask to Inspector Harwood the next morning. I believe Isabel was being watched, not by Rosalind, but by someone who wanted her secrets kept or exploited, someone who wore this. Harwood turned the mask over in his hands. "L.M.," he said aloud. "Not Miles," Miss Marple corrected. "Leonard Marchmont. Rosalind's late husband. But he's been dead 5 years." "Exactly," she said. And yet I believe his influence is still very much alive in this house. The letter in the ashes. The following morning broke cold and gray. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Harrowby Hall, as though nature herself were whispering in hushed tones, reluctant to disturb the fragile calm that had settled after Miles Renfield's quiet confession. But Miss Marple knew the calm was deceptive. There was one thread still dangling, one truth not yet confirmed, one voice not yet heard. And so she requested, politely but firmly, to see the fireplace in Rosalind Marchmont's private study. Rosalind looked startled. Whatever for? Because there was a letter. And I believe it was burned. The fireplace, James, the butler, led Miss Marple to the study and stood respectfully by the door while she crouched beside the fireplace, using the tip of her umbrella to sift through the cooled ashes. Her motions were careful, precise, and then she found it. A piece of envelope, not fully consumed. And on it, the telltale handwriting of Isabel Marchmont. Just a few words had survived. ... Be opened only in the event that I should. Miss Marple folded the fragment and rose. Rosalind stood rigid at the doorway now. She asked me to destroy it, she said softly. I didn't want to, but I was afraid. Afraid of what? Miss Marple asked gently. That it would change. Everything. That it would make her death even more scandalous. You don't understand. The hall, the trust, my name. They're all connected. If Isabel's past came out, the trustees might. They would have questioned your guardianship of the estate, Miss Marple said. Rosalind nodded, and I would have lost everything. Inspector Harwood's decision. That afternoon, Inspector Harwood met Miss Marple in the conservatory, where the scent of fresh rain drifted in through the open windows. He won't fight the charge, Harwood said. Miles, he's agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter. Says it was impulsive, that he panicked. Poisoned the wine in a fit of rage. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. I believe that's true. He was not a cold-blooded killer. Merely wounded, and used to controlling what hurt him. Harwood shook his head. This place, Miss Marple, it's beautiful on the outside, but it's full of shadows. She smiled faintly. I've always said it is not the streets of London that hold the greatest dangers, Inspector. It's the parlors of English villages, where everyone knows your name and your history. A new arrival just, as the day seemed to be winding to its grim conclusion, a car pulled into the gravel driveway. Out stepped a tall woman in a smart coat and wide-brimmed hat. Vivian Marchmont, Isabel's sister. She had arrived from Vienna too late to see Isabel alive. Miss Marple met her at the door. I'm so sorry, Vivian said quietly. I had hoped there was still time. There wasn't, Miss Marple said, taking her gloved hand. But perhaps there's still time for truth. Vivian looked at her curiously, and so Miss Marple led her into the music room and began to explain. The final puzzle piece. I knew about Miles, Vivian said, once the story had been told. But I never imagined he would, that he could. You don't seem shocked, Miss Marple observed. Vivian's voice was steady. In our family, pain has always traveled silently. Isabel tried to live above her past. Miles lived inside his. It's no wonder they collided. There was silence between them. Then Vivian placed a small object on the piano, a silver locket, identical to the one found with Isabel's body. I brought this for Rosalind. I suppose it's time the truth belonged to more than one woman. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the time for masks is over. The artist's alibi, Inspector Harwood, was a practical man. He didn't like dramatic gestures or poetic motives. He liked footprints, receipts, and fingerprints. But what Miss Marple had just shown him, the faint scratched initials, the emotional undertones of betrayal between mother and son, unsettled him more than he expected. He stared out the window of Harrowby Hall's morning room, where dusk had settled like smoke. "You're telling me Miles Renfield poisoned his own mother, to claim a fortune he was never promised?" "I'm telling you," Miss Marple said gently, "that Isabel Marchmont was not the woman he imagined she was. And when he discovered the truth, he killed her." "But why now?" Harwood turned back to her. He'd known her for years. Why murder her here, during a ball, in front of everyone? Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. Because she had finally made her decision. She was going to confess everything publicly. She had written letters to Rosalind, to her solicitor, and even one to the trustees of the Harrowby estate. "Where are those letters?" "Destroyed," she said simply, "by the one person who had everything to lose if they surfaced." Later that evening, the confrontation Miles Renfield was in the music room when they found him, seated at the grand piano, one finger tapping out a haunting minor scale dot. He turned calmly when they entered. "Inspector, Miss Marple." "What a charming surprise." "We've come to talk about Isabel Marchmont," Harwood said flatly. "Still?" Miles smiled. "I think every possible angle has been covered, don't you?" "Not quite," Miss Marple replied. "You see, there's something you left out of your statement." Miles tilted his head. "Oh?" Miss Marple walked slowly to the fireplace, where the portrait had been rehung earlier that day. "You told us you painted this, and that's partly true. But Isabel paid for it. And someone else, someone with an interest in what it might reveal, helped design it." Miles said nothing. "You scratched her initials into the frame, not out of pride, but bitterness. She had promised you a place in her world, and denied it." Still, he did not speak. But his hand, resting on the piano keys, began to tremble. "She told Rosalind everything," Miss Marple continued. "And you realized that if Isabel exposed your real parentage, if she handed over those letters to the estate lawyers, you'd be entitled to nothing. No name, no inheritance, no place." Finally, Miles stood. "You think I poisoned her? My own mother?" Miss Marple met his eyes. "I think you loved a woman who didn't love you back the way you needed. And I think, in the end, your pride was stronger than your grief." The missing evidence. Harwood stepped forward. "We have your fingerprint on the locket she was found holding." Miles paled. "That proves nothing." "It proves you opened it after she was dead, looking for the note you thought she left Rosalind. And we have Basil's testimony," Harwood added. "You instructed him to deliver the wine glass, the poisoned glass." Miles opened his mouth, closed it, then sat slowly on the piano bench. For a moment, the room was silent, but for the ticking of the grandfather clock dot. Then, almost in a whisper, Miles said, "She was going to ruin me. After everything. After all I'd done to find her." "You didn't find her," Miss Marple said quietly now. "She found you. And when she saw what you'd become, she changed her mind." That landed like a stone. Miles closed his eyes. "I only meant to frighten her." A portrait in red and gold. It was nearing dusk when Miss Marple asked to see the painting. The portrait of Isabel Marchmont had been moved from the ballroom after the murder, covered in a white cloth and stored in the long hallway outside. The family gallery. Rosalind hadn't had the heart to look at it again. Or so she said. But Miss Marple suspected something more. The butler, James, helped her lift the cloth. Beneath it, the canvas shimmered with sharp, modern colors. Not at all the sort of style one expected to find in a house like Harrowby Hall. Isabel, or rather, her painted likeness, sat posed in a red silk gown with gold filigree. Her expression, direct, unreadable, and strange dot, it was an arresting image, and one that had more to say than it first seemed. Miles Renfield had painted it, and he had signed it. But in the lower left corner, beneath the scrolled signature, was something odd. A second signature, nearly invisible, scratched faintly into the varnish. Miss Marple, bent forward. L. Later, in the drawing room, she confronted Rosalind with it. Did you notice the second signature on Isabel's portrait? She asked gently. Rosalind's face went still. I didn't look closely. But you knew it was there, Miss Marple said. Because Isabel told you. She told you what it meant. That someone else, someone with a legal claim, had contributed to the commission. Rosalind stood. It means nothing. It means Miles Renfield wasn't just her son. He was her collaborator, possibly her co-heir. And with her gone, he would stand to claim not just the painting, but something far more valuable. The Harrowby Trust. Rosalind said quietly. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Harwood that evening with the full picture. Isabel was blackmailing Rosalind, she explained. But not for money, for status. She wanted public recognition of her son and of her past, and Rosalind refused. Yes, but the painting was a step too far. Rosalind feared what might follow. Public disgrace, legal challenge, even a change in her control of the estate. But Rosalind didn't kill her. No, Miss Marple said. The killer needed something more direct, more immediate. Someone who had both motive and access. She paused. Miles Renfield. Harwood looked startled, but he was her son. And that is exactly why he killed her. The final clue. Miss Marple held out the letter, the one Isabel had left Rosalind. And Rosalind had hidden in her knitstand. Isabel intended to cut Miles off. She was going to tell the truth, but not give him what he thought he was owed. She wanted forgiveness. He wanted inheritance. Harwood read the last line aloud. I have made peace with what cannot be mine, and I will ensure the past rests. Not returns, Miss Marple nodded. He poisoned her wine. He manipulated Basil into delivering it, and he watched her die, knowing no one would suspect him. A grieving son, an artist, a guest. But he made one mistake, Harwood said. Softly. Yes, Miss Marple replied. He signed the painting. Secrets in the Greenhouse. The apothecary garden at Harrowby Hall was tucked behind the east wing, quiet, shaded, and overgrown with memories. Once a source of healing herbs and tinctures for the family, it had long since fallen into semi-retirement. Kept only out of habit and nostalgia, Miss Marple walked slowly through the low gate just after dawn, her boots crunching on gravel still damp with dew. She had always believed gardens told the truth. People left fingerprints not just on silver and glass, but in the way they arranged and nurtured living things. The greenhouse stood at the far end. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of rosemary, lavender, and something bitter, something darker. She opened the door. There, among trays of seedlings and jars of dried herbs, stood Mrs. Langton, already at work. Her back was to Miss Marple, her hands deftly snipping brown leaves. From a tray of HELLEBO, or E. She didn't turn when she spoke. You're very early, Miss Marple. As are you, Mrs. Langton. The older woman turned then, her eyes sharp behind round spectacles. Some of us have habits that die hard. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And some habits are very useful, like knowing which plants can cure and which can kill. There was a moment of silence between them. Then Mrs. Langton removed her gloves, very slowly. Why don't you ask what you came to ask? Very well, Miss Marple said. Did you supply the extract that killed Isabel Marchmont? Mrs. Langton looked neither shocked nor angry. I did not, but you knew about it. A pause. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. And you've protected someone you felt deserved it. Mrs. Langton gave a small, sad smile. Rosalind. They sat in the greenhouse's back corner, where the early light filtered through glass panes stained with ivy. She was frightened, Mrs. Langton said quietly. Isabel came to the house the day before the masquerade. Not to plead, to threaten. She'd found out more than just Miles Renfield's identity. She had letters, Proof. About the estate. About the Harrowby Trust. Rosalind thought she was going to lose everything. Reputation, inheritance, even the hall itself. But she didn't kill Isabel, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Langton shook her head. No, she confronted her in the dressing room and left angry. But when she returned, Isabel was already on the floor. Miss Marple leaned forward. And Jimmy? Mrs. Langton's expression darkened. He had overheard them arguing. He went in after Rosalind stormed out. And when he saw the locket, saw the name inside, he panicked. He poisoned the wine? No, the wine had already been tainted. I believe the poison was in the glass from the start, left there before the masquerade even began. Miss Marple sat back. Then who prepared that tray? Mrs. Langton took a deep breath. The footman, Basil. Back inside the hall, Miss Marple asked to speak with Basil, the nervous, slight-footed young man who had served drinks during the ball. He arrived within minutes, pale and clearly frightened. "Did I do something wrong, miss?" he asked, wringing his hands. "That depends," Miss Marple said. "Who asked you to prepare the wine tray for the red dressing room?" Basil hesitated. "It weren't one of the family. It was that artist fellow. Said it was a private request." "For a special meeting? Miles Renfield?" "Yes, miss." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did he give you the glass?" "No, it was already on the tray. I just carried it." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat once more with Inspector Harwood. "So," he said, "Miles Renfield lied to us." She nodded. "Partially. He did meet Isabel in Florence, and he is her son. But what he left out was motive." Harwood looked grim. He was in the red dressing room after all. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and he had more to gain than anyone." Chapter 10. Tea, Truth, and Fingerprints. Next morning broke damp and gray, as if the skies themselves were unsure how to proceed. The village of Elmsworth moved slowly, still half whispering about the masked murder at Harrowby Hall. But inside the manor, something had changed. Rosalind was no longer weeping. She had spent the night reading and rereading Isabel's letter. By breakfast, her poise had returned, but it was different now. Brittle, guarded. Miss Marple noticed it immediately. They sat together by the window in the breakfast room, sipping weak Earl Grey and nibbling at toast. The silence between them was companionable but purposeful. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. "Rosalind, your half-brother poses no threat to you." Rosalind glanced up. "Legally, perhaps, but socially. The scandal would devour us." "You're not frightened of scandal," Miss Marple said gently. "You're frightened of what else he might reveal." Rosalind didn't answer. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. After breakfast, Miss Marple returned to her room, but not to rest. Instead, she began preparing an old-fashioned trick she had used more than once in her time. It required 3 things: a small glass, a cloth, and a light dusting of black powder, sourced this time from the groundsman's workshop, under the pretense of needing something to clean scuff marks from her shoes. By mid-morning, she was ready. She invited the remaining guests, those who had lingered in the aftermath of the arrest, to a quiet farewell tea in the conservatory. It was a simple affair, polite. Curious. Miles Renfield arrived first, quiet and watchful. Mrs. Langton, Rosalind's companion, hovered near the lemon biscuits, her eyes darting nervously. Lady Grayson, a distant cousin, brought a stiff bouquet and an expression of theatrical sympathy. And finally, Jimmy Harrowby, still red-eyed and fidgeting with a cigarette he never lit. They sipped and chatted. Miss Marple let them talk, and when the time was right, she brought out a small glass decanter with a silver stopper. "A little homemade elderflower cordial," she said cheerfully. "It's been in my family for generations." She poured a little into each guest's glass, except one. She handed Jimmy the stopper, asking, "Would you be a dear and twist this tight for me again?" He did so with a half-smile, unaware. When the guests left, each offering bland thanks and hasty goodbyes, Miss Marple took the silver stopper, wrapped it carefully, and returned to her room. There, under lamplight, she dusted it. A clear, perfect fingerprint. That evening, she met Inspector Harwood in the study. "This fingerprint," she said, placing the evidence on the table, "matches the one we found on the inner rim of Isabel's locket." Harwood stared at it. "We assumed that was Lane's." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Percival Lane touched the outside, not the inside. Only someone who had opened it before her death could have left this one." Harwood was silent. "Which means Jimmy Harrowby was with her in that dressing room." But Miss Marple wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said. "The poison. You mean the amyl nitrate?" She shook her head. "No, the secondary substance. The trace amounts found in the wine glass." Harwood frowned. "The lab said it was a rare extract, possibly from the black hellebore." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "A toxic plant that only blooms in certain gardens. Harrowby Hall has one such garden in the old apothecary plot behind the east greenhouse." Harwood was still staring at her. "And who tends that plot?" Miss Marple looked grave. "Mrs. Langton, Rosalind's companion, former nurse, former herbalist." Chapter 9. The Artist with No Past. It was nearly dusk when Miss Marple arrived at the ivy-covered cottage just beyond the edge of Elmsworth, a stone's throw from the river bend where wild foxgloves grew in pale clumps. A sign near the front. Gate read simply, "Miles Renfield Portraits and Studies." The door was ajar, and the smell of linseed oil and turpentine drifted into the evening air. Inside, the studio was a curious mix of mess and method. Canvases leaned against the walls. Half-finished sketches cluttered the desk, and a kettle whistled faintly from the adjoining kitchen. Miles Renfield stood at the easel, brush in hand, a smudge of cobalt blue on his shirt collar. "Miss Marple," he said, not turning, "you've come to ask about Isabel Marchmont." She didn't reply at once. Instead, she studied him tall, thoughtful, a man in his 30s with a quiet intensity. And something else, a kind of old grief, as though he'd carried silence too long. "You knew her well?" she asked gently. "I met her 2 years ago in Florence," he replied, wiping his hands. "She was traveling alone. We had long talks. She offered to sit for a portrait, and then she told me." "Told you what?" "That I was born here, in England, that my father was a man of means, that she had protected me from scandal by sending me to Italy with a cousin when I was still a baby." "And she never named him?" Miles gave a short laugh. "Oh, she did. But she said it didn't matter anymore. He was dead. And I was too. Be free of all of it, unless I chose otherwise." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But you did choose otherwise." He sat across from her. "She wanted me to meet him, the family, to see what kind of man I might have become. She didn't want money or status, just recognition. She invited me to the masquerade so I could see them, unfiltered." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked. "Recognize anyone?" He hesitated. Then, "Yes, Rosalind Harrowby. I'd seen a photograph years ago. She has our father's eyes." Miss Marple folded her hands, thoughtful. "Did you speak with Isabel that night?" "We arranged to meet in the red dressing room at midnight," Miles said. "But she never came. I waited for nearly half an hour. Then someone else arrived." "Who?" "A man. In costume. Tall. Wearing a harlequin mask. He said Isabel had left. That she'd grown ill, and asked him to tell me not to worry." "And you believed him?" Miles looked away. "I wanted to. I thought perhaps she'd changed her mind." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She hadn't. She was already dead by then. When Miss Marple returned to the Harrowby estate, the house was quiet. But in the library, she found Inspector Harwood sitting by the fire, his notebook in hand. "Back already?" He said, "I've just been to see Mr. Renfield." "And?" "He is Isabel's son, as the letter suggested. But he didn't kill her. He was meant to meet her, but someone intercepted that plan." Harwood frowned. "Another player in the game?" Miss Marple nodded. "Someone who had access to the guest list. Someone who could send a fake message. Someone already in the house." The clock struck 10. Harwood looked up. "You think there's more to come?" "I'm certain of it," said Miss Marple. "Because while one crime has been solved, another has not." "What crime?" She turned toward the window, where the Harrowby crest glowed faintly in the moonlight. "Theft, not of jewels or paintings, but of identity." Harwood stared at her. "Someone in this house is not who they claim to be." Chapter 8. A shadow in the portrait room. The aftermath of a confession is never neat. Not in Elmsworth. 2 days after Percival Lane's arrest, the Harrowby estate remained locked in a strange half-silence. Guests had left quietly. Rosalind retired to her room and had taken, for the first time in memory, to weeping in the late afternoons. Jimmy Harrowby vanished on long rides through the moors, and the staff moved with caution, as if afraid to breathe too loudly. But Miss Marple remained, and for good reason. She did not believe the mystery was entirely over. It was in the early evening that she asked to see the portrait room, the long gallery at the west side of the house, where generations of Harrowbys stared down from their ornate frames with varying degrees of disapproval. Miss Marple stood in front of one in particular, Lord Edwin Harrowby, Rosalind's late father. A sharp-browed man with eyes like storm clouds. He was a difficult man, came a voice behind her. Rosalind had entered silently. "So I gathered," Miss Marple said kindly. "He ran this family with fists and silence. My mother wilted under him, but I learned to hide, to smile, to charm, and to keep secrets." Rosalind flinched. "I didn't kill Isabel." "No, but you almost protected someone who did." "Why?" Rosalind hesitated, then moved closer to the window. The light cast long shadows across the carpet. "Because of something I found. A letter, weeks ago, in my father's study, after he died. It mentioned Isabel, and a son." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Go on." She said the child was his, that she had kept the secret for decades, but now she wanted to claim the name. She wanted justice. "A son," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "An heir?" Rosalind nodded. "If true, he would have a claim to part of the estate. Enough to change everything." At evening, Miss Marple sat in the library long after the house had gone to bed. She reread the notes in her small book. The murder was solved. And yet, why had Isabel come to the masquerade at all? Why did she wait until the end of the evening? And why, if she was blackmailing Percival Lane, did she seem so confident? Unless she wasn't blackmailing him, she was testing him. The following morning, Miss Marple made an unexpected trip to Marchmont House, a crumbling estate on the edge of the village. She had written ahead and was received politely by Isabel's former lady's maid. Nora Bell. Nora was in her late 50s, red-eyed but dignified, and fiercely loyal. "She always said someone would kill her one day," she told Miss Marple. "Over tea, but not for money. For truth." "What truth was that?" "She never told me outright," Nora said. "But she'd started talking about the boy. Said he was coming to Elmsworth. Said it was time." "Did she name him?" Nora reached into her apron and pulled out an envelope. "She told me to send this. If anything happened to her." It was addressed, in Isabel's slanting hand, to Mrs. Rosalind Harrowby. Miss Marple. Return to the estate at once. Rosalind opened the letter with trembling hands. She read in silence, then sat down slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. "It's true," she whispered. "She had my father's child. She raised him abroad. He's now living under another name." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And that name?" "Rosalind." Looked up. "Miles Renfield. He's an artist. He moved to Elmsworth 3 months ago." Miss Marple gave a quiet, knowing nod. She had met Mr. Renfield at the masquerade. He was the only guest without a mask. Chapter 7. The Man Who Knew Too Much. The next morning dawned humid and yellow, with a strange heaviness in the air, as though the sky itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple rose early. She always did, long before the household stirred. She had already completed her usual knitting, a half-finished sock in soft blue wool, and taken a quiet walk to the edge of the Harrowby grounds, where the trees grew dense and moss-covered today. However, she had more than exercise in mind. She was looking for someone. The gardener's cottage sat at the edge of the estate, barely more than a shack with ivy creeping across the windows. Inside, John Ludlow, the long-serving groundskeeper, was trimming back a broken fern when Miss Marple tapped politely at his door. He looked up, surprised. "Miss Marple, ma'am. Didn't expect—" "I'm sorry to trouble you, Mr. Ludlow," she said pleasantly, "but I rather thought you might have noticed something during your early rounds. A small thing, perhaps." He scratched at his chin, thoughtful. "Well, the night of the masquerade, I did see someone sneaking out through the orchard gate. 11:15. Give or take." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Did you recognize them?" "I did not. Tall figure, cloak and all. I assumed it was a guest taking the long way round to the stables. But, the next morning I found the orchard gate unlocked, and a glove black leather half hidden in the grass." "May I see it?" Ludlow hesitated, then nodded. "Kept it in case it meant something." He fetched the glove from a drawer. It was slim and expensive, clearly handmade. Inside the wrist, faintly written in ink, were 3 initials, R.L.H. By noon, Inspector Harwood had summoned the household again. This time he was tired, not frustrated, resigned. The investigation had stretched on longer than expected, and everyone in the house was showing cracks. Everyone, except Miss Marple. She sat calmly near the hearth as Harwood laid the glove on the table. "Does this belong to anyone here?" he asked. No one answered. Lady Rosalind didn't even look at it, but Miss Marple's eyes, as usual, missed nothing. "I rather think," she said softly, "that initials can mislead, especially when they are not a monogram, but a misdirection." Harwood frowned. "And what do you mean by that?" She glanced toward the window, where Jimmy Harrowby stood, arms folded. "I mean that those initials do not belong to Reginald Lionel Harrowby, as one might first suspect. They belong to Rosalind Lara Harrowby. They are her gloves." A silence settled over the room like a dropped curtain. Rosalind blinked slowly. "I've never—" "You wore them when you left the house that night," Miss Marple continued gently, "to confront Isabel Marchmont alone. You didn't expect her to be dead. You thought you'd arrive before your husband." Rosalind looked down at her lap. Her knuckles were white. Miss Marple turned back to Harwood. "But Rosalind is not the murderer. She left the glove in the orchard after she found the body. She panicked, ran. That's why she never came forward. Fear does dreadful things to people, Inspector. And the real killer?" Miss Marple took a deep breath. Her voice, when it came, was soft but precise. "The man who lured Isabel to that room. The man who wore the mask and carried the silver cigarette case. The man who knew her secrets because he once shared them." She looked across the room, not at the Harrowbys, not at Harwood, but at the guest slumped in the far corner. "Percival. Lane. Percival laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Me? A penniless cousin? You must be joking. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Indeed, you are penniless. That is precisely the point. Isabel Marchmont had written you into her new will, a generous legacy. But she also intended to expose your financial crimes. You intercepted her letter, lured her into the red dressing room under the guise of romance, wore the mask, made it look like a lover's rendezvous gone wrong. Percival's hands twitched. You didn't mean to kill her, Miss Marple said gently. Not at first. But she threatened to go public, so you struck her. Once, hard enough to silence her forever. Harwood stood. Percival bolted, but he didn't get far. Phelps was waiting at the door. Later, as the sun set across Elmsworth, Miss Marple returned to the garden bench, now peaceful again. Jimmy came to sit beside her. His face was drawn but calm. You knew, he said. Even before the glove. I suspected. But one must be fair, even to a murderer. Let them show you who they really are. And you always watch. She smiled. Old ladies often see what others ignore. Chapter 6. The garden at dusk by the sixth day. Even the roses seemed nervous. The Harrowby garden was known throughout Elmsworth for its award-winning displays. Ancient hedges pruned into immaculate walls, trellised vines draped like theater, curtains and flower beds blooming in rows so symmetrical they might have been ruled with a compass. But now, the garden paths were scuffed with hurried footprints. The benches sat empty, and the air was thick with the scent of overblown lilacs and tension. Miss Marple sat on one of those benches, quietly watching a honeybee thread its way through a collapsing peony. You know, she said aloud, flowers never lie. If someone trampled through here last night, they'd leave their guilt behind in the dirt. Jimmy Harrowby, who had just walked past with his jacket over one shoulder and cigarette trembling in his fingers, froze. I didn't expect anyone to be here, he muttered. It's a lovely place to think, Miss Marple said gently, even when one doesn't want to think at all. Jimmy sat beside her, silent for a long while. The gravel crunched under his boots as he leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes bloodshot. I didn't kill her, he said suddenly. I never said you did. She told me she was going to ruin him. Your father? He gave a half-laugh, half-groan. No, worse, she was going to tell Rosalind. Ah, Isabel. She thought she had power. She thought secrets made her safe. But she underestimated how far someone would go to keep those secrets buried. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Did you see her that night? She asked. I did, around 10 o'clock. She was wearing the mask. She said, you'd better warn him, Jimmy, because if he doesn't come clean, I will. Then she walked away. Into the house? He nodded. And you didn't follow her? No, he said, staring into the shadows beneath a hedge. But someone else did. Later that afternoon, Inspector Harwood called a private meeting. Miss Marple, the Harrowbys, Jimmy, Rosalind, and Percival Lane were all seated in the drawing room, where the fire was lit despite the summer heat. Harwood held up the velvet mask. We've traced the seamstress, he said. A Miss Gray. She confirmed she made this. To order. A custom piece. And who ordered it? Asked Percival Lane, leaning forward eagerly. Harwood's eyes shifted. That's where it gets interesting. The name on the order was Mr. R. Marsh. Silence. Doesn't exist, Harwood continued. No address, no payment method. But Miss Gray remembered the face. She said it was an older gentleman, distinguished, paid in cash, smelled of expensive cologne. Miss Marple sipped her tea. A poor alias, she murmured. If one wants to hide, one must choose a mask that doesn't draw attention. That evening, Miss Marple took a turn about the garden again, this time accompanied by young Mary Fitch. Mary was quiet at first. clutching her shawl. Then, as they passed the far edge of the property near the gardener's shed, she blurted, "Miss Marple, I saw someone." The old lady stopped. "When?" "The night of the party. I was coming back from the village. I'd forgotten the punch bowl." "Who did you see, dear?" Mary looked around as though afraid the hedges might overhear her. "I saw someone leave the back of the house around 11. They were dressed like a footman, but something was wrong." "What was wrong?" "They walked too confidently. Like they weren't used to taking orders." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "And did this footman return?" Mary shook her head. "No, ma'am, but I did find something. I didn't think it mattered at the time." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter, elegant, expensive, and engraved, very faintly, with a crest. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. It was the crest of the Marchmont family. That night, alone in her room, Miss Marple made 3 columns in her notebook. Who wanted Isabel silenced? Who had opportunity? Who changed clothes that night? Only one name appeared in all 3. She drew a neat circle around it. Then she added a 4th word beneath, motive. And in that moment, the final piece began to click into place. But Miss Marple didn't smile, because she knew, as she had always known, that even when the truth emerged, it rarely brought peace. Chapter 5. A letter in the ashes by the 5th day after the murder. The mood in Harrowby Hall had shifted. The initial shock had worn off, but something heavier had settled in its place. Suspicion. Quiet, creeping, unwelcome. The kind that made people lower their voices and lock their bedroom doors at night. It had begun to dawn on everyone that the killer wasn't some outsider, a thief, a madman, or even a stranger from town. No. It was someone inside the house. Inspector Harwood had spent the morning interviewing the Harrowby staff again. Each maid, footman, and gardener had been called in, their statements checked, their movements mapped out to the minute. Miss Marple had not been asked to help, but she had been watching from her place in the morning room, not the interviews themselves, but the faces of the others waiting their turn. Lady Rosalind, pale and tight-lipped, pretending to read. Sir Reginald, chewing his pipe stem. Jimmy, staring out the window, still jumpy as a cricket. No one sat next to each other. No one spoke. Miss Marple, meanwhile, calmly finished her tea. Afternoon, a second peculiar item came to light. It was discovered not by the police, but by Mary Fitch, who had been cleaning out the hearth in the small lounge beside the library. She'd been told to check for traces of ash that might indicate burned paper, and that's exactly what she found. At the very bottom of the fireplace, beneath the cooled coals and brittle gray ash, was the charred corner of a letter. Mary brought it straight to Harwood, who turned it over with his tweezers and squinted down at the smudged writing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, reading upside down as easily as she might a knitting pattern. Double quotes. Can't do this anymore. It isn't right. You promised me, Harwood swore softly. The signature had been completely burned away, but the style of the writing, tight, slanted, elegant, was unmistakably feminine. A letter from Isabel, he muttered. To whom? Miss Marple. Asked mildly. They both knew it could be damning. The phrasing was personal. It reeked of betrayal. At dinner, only 5 guests sat at the long formal table. Sir Reginald and Lady Rosalind at either end, with Jimmy, Miss Marple, and the Harrowbys. Cousin, stiff, gossip-loving Mr. Percival Lane, seated along the sides. The air was thin and brittle. Jimmy barely ate. Rosalind didn't speak. Reginald drank more than he usually did, which was saying something. Mr. Lane tried to fill the silence. Horrid business, isn't it? Though I dare say it's all just some affair gone wrong. These society women, they play with fire. Men, too, Always scandal bubbling beneath the surface. This house isn't what it used to be, you know? Miss Marple smiled. Houses are rarely what they used to be. But people, they tend to behave in patterns. And when those patterns break, that's when things begin to unravel. Sir Reginald looked up sharply. Patterns? He asked. What do you mean? I mean, said Miss Marple, that someone went to a great deal of trouble to hide the truth. But often, in hiding one thing, they reveal another. She didn't elaborate. But she noticed Lady Rosalind set down her wine-glass without drinking from it. And Jimmy, poor, weary Jimmy, was staring down at his untouched plate as though it might offer him an answer. That night, Harwood and Phelps laid out all the evidence in the study, not the mask, the letter fragment, the cuff-link, the list of guests, and a new item, a silver cigarette case engraved with initials that had been nearly rubbed off. It had been found under a sofa in the lounge, wedged so tightly that only a deep clean had revealed it. Miss Marple turned it gently in her hands. Too large for a lady's pocket, she noted, and too elegant for a servant. This was hidden, not lost. Perhaps someone returned from the murder, changed clothes, and tried to discard anything that didn't match their new identity. Phelps frowned. But why not burn it too, like the letter? Miss Marple set the case down with a soft click. Because they were interrupted, she said. Murder makes even the cleverest people sloppy. Before retiring, Miss Marple paid one final visit to the red dressing room. She carried a small lantern this time and looked with fresh eyes. She noticed a mark near the wardrobe, a heel scuff. Men's shoes. Heavy. She opened the wardrobe. It was empty, but on the back of the door, faint, barely visible, was a smudge of lipstick, pale rose. The exact shade Isabel Marchmont had been wearing. She had been here, not just as a victim, but of her own will. Waiting. Someone had sent that note to lure her upstairs. Someone she trusted, someone who had worn a velvet mask and promised her something they never intended to give. Miss Marple returned to her room and, in her tidy, sloping script, wrote, not a crime of rage, but of calculation. A meeting was arranged. A confrontation turned fatal. Who benefits from Isabel's silence? She underlined the word benefits, then sat back, tapping the pencil against her lip. Outside, the trees rustled. The wind was rising again. And inside, the house, the killer, now cornered by truth, not law, was watching for cracks to appear. They always did. And Miss Marple was very, very good at seeing what others missed. Chapter 4. Behind the Red Door. The Harrowby estate was old enough to have secrets buried in the stonework. There were passageways once used by servants, attics never fully emptied, closets that locked from the inside, and, at the far end of the guest wing, a narrow door painted red. It was odd because nothing else in the house was red. It had no knob, only a keyhole. Most assumed it led nowhere, or to some locked-up utility cupboard. Miss Marple, naturally, had noticed it on her first visit upstairs. And by the fourth day, after Isabel Marchmont's murder, she asked the butler about it. Red door at the end of the corridor? She said, stirring a lump of sugar into her tea. He stiffened slightly. That's the old dressing room, ma'am. Long sealed. No one goes in there? Sealed? Yes, ma'am. Not used since Lady Harrowby's mother passed. Been locked for years. Miss Marple gave a soft and stirred her tea a moment longer. And I suppose no one has the key. The butler's mouth thinned. Only Sir Reginald, if anyone. That was quite enough for Miss Marple. By late afternoon, she had borrowed a hairpin from Mary Fitch and stood in front of the red door alone. It was a warm day, the corridor thick with silence. Far off, she could hear the clatter of teacups from downstairs and the rustle of a newspaper. The keyhole was old, brass and oddly well polished, not the dusty relic she'd expected. That, in itself, was interesting. Within 3 careful minutes, the lock clicked softly open. She pushed the door inwards. The dressing room was dim and close with dust. A small round window let in just enough light to see outlines. A mirror, a low stool, a faded chaise lounge, and a narrow wardrobe against the wall. Everything was still covered in white dust sheets, like ghostly furniture waiting for a summons. But it wasn't the furniture that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the scent, faint, recent. Something floral and expensive. A modern perfume that didn't belong to an abandoned room. She stepped further in and pulled the dust sheet from the yash. Vanity. The mirror was cracked in one corner. On the glass surface, she noticed a single deliberate fingerprint. Someone had leaned in close, recently. And then she saw it. A torn scrap of dark red velvet, snagged on the corner of the chaise, the same material as the mask. Someone had been here, recently, possibly the night of the murder. Downstairs, Inspector Harwood was less than pleased. "You picked a lock, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his temples. "I did no such thing," she replied calmly. The door practically opened itself. One really ought to speak with the staff about these things. "And what exactly did you find?" Miss Marple handed over the scrap of velvet in a small envelope. "I suspect someone changed costume there. Possibly Mr. Devereux." Harwood frowned. "You think the murderer hid in that room?" "Why? To become someone else," Miss Marple said. "It's quite simple, really. The ball was full of masks and music and dim light. All it would take is a quick costume change and a confident smile." Harwood exhaled. "We need more than scraps and guesses." "Then perhaps you should speak to young Jimmy Harrowby," Miss Marple said gently. "Ask him what he argued about with Mrs. Marchmont." Harwood blinked. "You're saying they argued?" "I'm saying," she replied, "that passion rarely hides well, even behind velvet." That evening, as dusk settled once again over the village of Elmsworth, Jimmy Harrowby returned to Harrowby Hall. He looked thinner, weather-beaten. There was a dark smear on one cuff that might have been oil or mud, and his eyes darted constantly. Like a man running from something he couldn't explain. Miss Marple met him on the gravel path. "You're back," she said pleasantly. He nodded, barely meeting her gaze. "Only for the night. Father wants me here." "I imagine he does." "You've been away quite a while. I needed time." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Grief does strange things, doesn't it?" Jimmy hesitated. "I wasn't grieving her." "No?" He looked away. She, Isabel, was involved with someone she shouldn't have been. "Your father?" A sharp intake of breath. "Everyone thinks that, but no. It wasn't him. It was someone else. Someone dangerous." "Then you should tell Inspector Harwood," Miss Marple said quietly. "Before someone else is hurt." Jimmy looked up. "You don't think it was suicide, then?" "No," Miss Marple said simply. "I think it was a performance, one that ended badly for the wrong person." She left him then standing beneath the shadow of the estate's tall oak trees. That night, in her bedroom, Miss Marple opened her notebook once more. She wrote, "The velvet mask was a decoy, not an identity. The murderer wanted to be seen as someone else. But Isabel recognized them anyway." She underlined the last line twice. Then she turned out her lamp. And somewhere deep in the house, unseeing, someone watched the hall from behind a barely open door. Waiting. Chapter 3. The Guest Who Vanished by Morning. The rain had passed and left behind a hush over Elmsworth. A kind of holding breath that comes after something unnatural has disturbed a peaceful place. The lawns at Harrowby Hall were waterlogged and gleaming. Damp petals from trampled floral arrangements littered the gravel drive. The great front doors, once flung open in welcome, now remained shut under police guard. No one had left the house. Not yet, and one man, it seemed, had never been found. His name, according to the guest list, was Mr. Lucien Devereux, written in neat, slanted ink on the RSVP card, which had arrived weeks earlier from a Mayfair address. But no one could remember inviting him. Not Sir Reginald, not Lady Rosalind, not the committee secretary who handled the lists. He was tall, said Daphne Grant, a local librarian who had danced with him during the second waltz. Charming, French or Belgian, maybe. Had one of those old-fashioned accents. Very refined. Wearing a black domino mask, added Mr. Parrish, the vicar's cousin. Like something out of an old opera. But where did he go? Asked Constable Phelps, baffled. The police had searched every room, questioned every guest. Lucien. Devereux had vanished as completely as if he'd walked through a wall. Only Miss Marple seemed unsurprised. People vanish when they're afraid, she murmured. Or when they've done something they shouldn't. Inspector Harwood had taken to pacing. He stood in the morning room, which now served as a temporary command center, scowling down at a hand-drawn layout of the estate. There are 3 ways out of the house, he told Phelps. Main hall, kitchen passage, and the garden doors. All were manned or locked by midnight. If this Devereux left, he did it before the murder, or in disguise. Could he have changed clothes? Phelps asked. Easily, Miss Marple said. From the sofa, her knitting on her lap, though the needles had long since stopped moving. In a house full of gowns and masks, I doubt anyone noticed who was under what. Phelps blinked at her. You think he's still here, miss? I think, she replied mildly, that people are very good at pretending to be someone they're not. That's what costumes are for. That's why this was the perfect place for a murder. Harwood exhaled sharply. We need a motive. Not just theater. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, but Inspector, in my experience, a broken heart is far more dangerous than a gun. By mid-morning, Miss Marple asked to see the guest bedroom wing. Politely, of course. She never insisted, but she had a way of making even a police inspector feel that it would be terribly rude not to oblige. She was accompanied by a maid, young Mary Fitch, who had been on duty during the masquerade. I don't like this. Ma'am, Mary said in a low voice. None of us do. She was nice, that Mrs. Marchmont, bit glamorous, always said thank you. And did she have any visitors last night? Before she went upstairs? Mary hesitated. Not that I saw. But earlier in the evening, before dinner, I saw her talking to Mr. Harrowby. Not Sir Reginald. The young one? Jimmy Harrowby? Mary nodded. They were standing merry. Close. I shouldn't say more. Only, she looked around nervously. He looked upset. She had her hand on his chest, like she was trying to calm him down. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. The young Harrowby heir, Jimmy, was not in the house, or so the butler claimed. He left early this morning on horseback, ma'am. Didn't say where. Left a note for his father. Something about needing to clear his head. That, to Miss Marple, was very curious indeed, especially considering what she had just been told by noon. The house had settled into that peculiar rhythm that comes after shock. Guests whispered behind teacups. Policemen moved in and out like ghosts. And Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit the ballroom again. There was something in that room. Something that had been bothering her. She stood beneath the high windows, among the scattered rose petals and leftover champagne glasses, and let her eyes drift. The orchestra pit. The balcony. The coat-room entrance. Then she saw a dot near the curtains at the edge of the ballroom. Barely visible, unless one was looking for it, was a small, glinting object. She bent carefully. Picked it up. A silver CUFFLINK dot simple. Elegant, and engraved with the initials. J.H. Miss Marple turned it over in her hand and allowed herself a very small nod. Jimmy Harrowby had been here, very near the spot where Isabel Marchmont had last been seen alive. And he had left in a hurry. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and a weak light filled the sky, Miss Marple returned to her room and wrote a single line in her notebook. The mask was not meant for Isabel. It was meant to deceive Isabel. She tapped the pencil once against her chin. Somewhere, someone had played a part, a perfect performance behind a false identity. But even the best actors leave something behind. A note, a glance, a cufflink. And very soon, Miss Marple thought, the velvet mask would slip. Chapter 2. Whispers behind the curtain. Storm that had threatened all afternoon finally arrived just before midnight. Thunder rolled over Elmsworth in slow, groaning waves, and lightning lit up the hedgerows like flashbulbs from an old camera. Inside Harrowby Hall, the guests, many still masked, clustered in small, tense groups, hushed voices chattering in corners. No one had left. They couldn't. Inspector Harwood had made that perfectly clear. It's now a murder investigation, he had announced in the drawing room, his mustache bristling with authority. No one leaves the estate until we've taken statements and completed a full search of the grounds. The velvet mask was the talk of the hour. Held in the dead woman's right hand, limp but not clutching. It had clearly not belonged. To her, the color was wrong. Her own mask, a navy blue piece with black trim, had already been found discarded beside her handbag. This second mask, dark red velvet with intricate silver embroidery, had no matching costume in the ballroom. It hadn't come from any guest, or at least no guest who admitted to it, which made Miss Marple very curious indeed. She sat now in the Harrowby Conservatory, a tall, glass room smelling of jasmine and candle wax, sipping her second cup of lukewarm tea while watching the storm roll across the lawn. Lightning illuminated the silhouette of the distant orchard. The rain made tiny rivers on the glass. She wasn't thinking about the rain. She was thinking about masks. Not the kind worn on faces, the kind people wore in conversation. The polite phrases, the slight changes in tone. The way Lady Rosalind had said, I hardly knew Isabel, just a fraction too quickly. Or how Sir Reginald, usually booming and full of pomp, had gone silent, answering Harwood's questions with clipped, dry replies. Everyone was playing their part. But someone, Miss Marple was quite certain, was pretending too well. Earlier that evening, Inspector Harwood had begun his interviews in the library, a deep, wood-paneled room with a persistent smell of pipe smoke and varnish. Lady Rosalind was first, dressed now in a black silk shawl, her hair pinned back in a sharp twist. She sat upright and poised, but her fingers trembled slightly against the armrest. I knew Isabel in the way one knows anyone who's always at parties, she said, coolly. She was a widow, well-traveled, flirtatious. Flirtatious with your husband? Harwood asked flatly. Lady Rosalind paused for just a moment. She enjoyed attention. I imagine she considered herself charming. And what was your relationship? With her? A tight smile. Cordial. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner at Harwood's invitation. If she's here, I might as well have her in the room, he muttered, said nothing. But her eyes didn't leave Lady Rosalind's hands. They were too still now. A complete change from earlier. Guilt? Or shock? Sir Reginald's interview was briefer. He looked tired, older somehow, his carefully groomed hair now slightly ruffled. He slumped into the leather armchair like a man carrying too many secrets. Isabel was a friend, he said. We had known each other since before the war. She visited occasionally, that's all. She visited alone? Harwood asked. She stayed in the guest wing, Inspector. You can check the register if you like. Harwood gave him a long look. Were you romantically involved? Sir Reginald's jaw twitched. Certainly not. And your wife, was she jealous of her? A long pause. My wife is a proud woman. She dislikes gossip. That doesn't make her jealous. Miss Marple stirred gently. Forgive me, Sir Reginald, but gossip is often very useful. It tells you what people want to believe, and occasionally what they fear is true. Sir Reginald looked at her as if he had just noticed she was in the room, and said nothing. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the house was quiet again. The guests had been shown to spare rooms. The ball was over. The police had secured the scene, and the body of Isabel Marchmont had been moved to the drawing room, covered with a white linen sheet. Miss Marple had not gone to bed. Instead, she asked Harwood if she might have a look at the deceased's belongings. Just her bag, really, he said, shrugging. Handed to me by the butler. There's a compact, a handkerchief, lipstick, and a folded piece of notepaper. Miss Marple accepted the bag with reverence, then carefully removed the note. It was brief, typed, unsigned. Meet me in the dressing room at 9. Wear something memorable. Leave your doubts behind. Miss Marple read it twice. Then again. Something memorable. And yet, not a clue in the handwriting. Typewritten. Cold. She returned the bag and stepped quietly down the hall. The masked ball. The stranger in the black costume. A note. A second mask. And a woman who had left her handbag behind, but carried someone else's mask into her death. It wasn't the glamour that had killed Isabel. It was the secret that followed her into that room. Miss Marple stopped beside a window and looked out into the night. Somewhere in the house, she knew, someone was very awake. And very afraid. The masquerade in Elmsworth was the kind of evening that only a village like Elmsworth could produce. Still air, a pale summer sky, and the sound of bees dying down in the distance as twilight approached. The hedges had been trimmed, the bunting was up, and every lamp-post in the high street had been given a ribbon. It was, after all, the night of the Elmsworth Charity Masquerade Ball, a yearly affair hosted at the estate of Sir Reginald Harrowby, and attended by everyone who fancied themselves a little above the rest, and most who didn't. The villagers loved it, not so much for the music or the wine, which was always warm, but for the spectacle of it. For one night, they could dress up, wear masks, pretend to be someone else, and dance in the soft glow of candlelight across Harrowby Hall's ancient ballroom floor. The theme this year was velvet and shadows. It was a little too theatrical for some tastes. Miss Marple, for instance, had been skeptical. She had received her invitation by hand, delivered by young Jimmy Harrowby, still smelling faintly of aftershave and horse stables, and had set it aside with a faint smile. Velvet and shadows indeed, but it was for charity, and her niece's friend from St. Mary Mead had helped arrange the floral displays. That, for Miss Marple, was quite reason enough to attend. And so at precisely 7 o'clock she arrived, dressed simply in dove gray, with a lace shawl and a delicate feathered half-mask. Her presence, as always, was understated but quietly noticed. The ballroom was full by 8. The chandeliers gleamed. The floorboards creaked just slightly beneath the dancers. There was champagne, flat music, a little off-tempo, and whispers. Always lively. Beneath the glitter and good humor, there was the sharp edge of gossip. Miss Marple sat near a poem in the corner, sipping lemonade, and listened. She arrived in Paris last week, whispered one woman behind a fan. Well, I heard he followed her, though not for the reasons she thinks. Have you seen that mask? Looks like something from a cheap theater. And then, they say Sir Reginald is rewriting his will again. She's made herself quite dispensable. Miss Marple's eyes, hidden behind her delicate mask, flickered toward the balcony. Lady Rosalind Harrowby stood there, lit from behind by a wall sconce, her dark red mask like a second face. She wasn't smiling, and she wasn't watching the guests. She was watching her husband out. Sir Reginald was at the far end of the ballroom, deep in conversation with a man Miss Marple did not recognize, tall, foreign-looking, with slick back hair and a dramatic black mask. There was something odd about the way Reginald was standing. Not rigid exactly, but cautious. Guarded, the orchestra struck up another waltz. Laughter broke out near the refreshment table. And then, somewhere behind the curtains, a clock struck 9. That was when the scream came. Not the sharp scream of pain. Not yet. This was the kind of scream that silenced an entire room. It came from upstairs, from the private wing of Harrowby Hall, and it was followed almost immediately by the frantic sound of footsteps and the sudden shout of a man's voice. "Get someone quickly." Lady Rosalind dropped her glass. It shattered on the floor. Sir Reginald stood frozen, his face pale. Miss Marple rose without fuss, placing her glass on the side table, and followed the others up the grand staircase. The room at the top of the stairs was Lady Rosalind's personal dressing chamber, and at its center, lying half across a velvet chaise, was a woman. She was dressed in green. Her mask, midnight blue with black feathers, had slipped slightly from her face. Her skin was the color of porcelain. Dead. No wounds, no blood, no struggle. Just stillness. It was Mrs. Isabel Marchmont, a guest, a widow, and though few said it aloud, a woman of questionable loyalty when it came to the company of men. Sir Reginald's manservant had found her. I knocked and came in to fetch her. "Rap, sir," he kept saying, his hands shaking. Harwood, the inspector from Midshire, was summoned within the hour. Familiar, meticulous, and tired, he recognized Miss Marple with a stiff nod when he arrived. "Another one," he muttered. "And in a ballroom, no less." Miss Marple simply adjusted her shawl and stepped aside. But as she watched the room, the positioning of the body, the half-emptied glass, the streak on the velvet cushion, her mind was already ticking. She had seen this before. Not the crime, not the mask, but the pattern. There was something in the air, in the way Lady Rosalind stood too still, and Sir Reginald avoided her eyes. In the missing glove beside the window-seat, in the foreign guest who had suddenly disappeared, in the mask, the velvet mask, still gripped in the hand of the dead woman.